In fall 2016, I moved into half of a really old house. It was built in the 1880s, close to the original campus of Indiana University. The area around the old campus had turned into a park, but it was filled with homeless people and drug addicts. The owners of the house turned it into a strange duplex. My friend had lived there before me, and he claimed it was haunted. But I didn't believe him. He was a bit of an odd guy. The layout of the house was strange. When you walked in the door, you were in a living room-like space. Then if you kept walking, there was a doorway to a bedroom. Past that was the kitchen. There were no doors except for the one to the bathroom and the one that led to the shared basement. My first night there was uneventful. I felt a little uncomfortable because I hadn't lived by myself in a long time. I was feeling lonely and on edge. I stayed up late and eventually fell asleep. But I woke up again around 3 in the morning. It's a cliche, I know. What woke me up was the sound of drumming. It sounded like a group of drummers were drumming on every flat surface of the living room. It went on for a while, and I was completely terrified. It was just a cacophony. After about 2 or 3 minutes, I finally gathered up the courage to get up and check on it. As soon as I passed the threshold to the living room, it just stopped. Nothing happened for the rest of the night, but I didn't get much sleep. A couple of days later, a friend was visiting. He was about to leave. We were standing by the front door next to my bookshelf. I told him about how I was having trouble sleeping and the story from the first night. As I was saying this, a book threw itself off the bookshelf and onto the floor 3 feet away. It had to fly past the dresser the shelf was perched on and landed between the two of us. He just gave me a creeped out look and said he had to go. I don't blame him. Eventually, I asked the guy in the other half of the duplex what was up. He had lived there for 8 years. He told me that no one stayed longer than a year, and they all reported the same stuff. For whatever reason, he said nothing ever happened on his side. It didn't make sense, but there it was. I tried to brush it off as my imagination played tricks on me. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. Every night, I would hear strange noises. Sometimes it sounded like whispers coming from the walls. Other times, it was the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth in the hallway outside my bedroom. I started to feel like I was being watched all the time. Whenever I was alone in the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was lurking in the shadows just out of sight. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a loud banging coming from the basement. It sounded like someone was pounding on the walls with a sledgehammer. I hesitated for a moment, then gathered up my courage and went to investigate. As I descended the creaky stairs to the basement, the banging grew louder and more frantic. My heart was pounding in my chest as I reached the bottom step and stepped into the dimly lit room. But to my surprise, there was nothing there. The room was empty, except for some old boxes and furniture covered in dusty sheets. The banging had stopped as suddenly as it had started. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that house. It was like there was a dark presence lurking in every corner, just waiting to strike. I tried to ignore it and go about my daily routine, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore the feeling of dread that hung over me like a dark cloud. One evening, as I was cooking dinner in the kitchen, I heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the bedroom. I dropped what I was doing and ran to investigate, my heart racing with fear. But when I reached the bedroom, there was no one there. The room was empty, and the only sound was the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. The strange occurrences were happening more and more frequently, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being tormented by something beyond my understanding. I knew I had to get out of that house, but I couldn't afford to move. I felt trapped, like a prisoner in my own home. Then one night, things took a turn for the worse. I was awoken from a fitful sleep by the sound of whispering coming from the walls. It was like 100 voices speaking at once, their words unintelligible but filled with malice and hatred. I felt a chill run down my spine as I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. And then suddenly, the whispering stopped, and I heard a low, guttural growling coming from the foot of my bed. I turned on the bedside lamp, expecting to see some kind of wild animal lurking in the darkness. But what I saw was far worse. Standing at the foot of my bed was a figure shrouded in darkness, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Its mouth was twisted into a cruel grin, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape the terror that gripped me. But I was frozen in place, unable to move or even breathe. And then, with a sudden burst of speed, the figure lunged towards me, its clawed hands reaching out to grab me. I closed my eyes and braced myself for the end, but nothing happened. When I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone, and I was alone in the darkness once more. I knew then that I had to leave that house, no matter the cost. I packed my bags and fled into the night, leaving behind the nightmares that haunted me in that cursed place. To this day, I still don't know what lurked in the shadows of that old house, and I pray that I never find out. But one thing is for certain. I will never forget the horrors that I witnessed there, and I will never set foot in that house again. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. When I was a solo driver, I was making a delivery in Memphis, TN. It was a hot summer evening, and the sun was setting over the city, casting a golden glow over the streets. I had been driving for hours, and my GPS led me to a warehouse on the outskirts of town. As I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed a sense of unease settling in. The building seemed abandoned, and the only sound was the creaking of old wooden crates in the wind. I grabbed my clipboard and stepped out of the truck, feeling the warm air envelop me. The receiver, a gruff-looking man with a thick beard, met me at the loading dock. He signed for the delivery, and I began to unload the cargo. But as the hours ticked by, he kept me waiting, claiming there was an issue with the paperwork. As the clock struck 7, my driving time was up. I needed to find a place to park for my mandatory 10-hour reset. The receiver suggested I head to the nearby TA Petro truck stop in West Memphis, just across the state line. I thanked him and climbed back into my rig, feeling frustrated and tired. The drive to the truck stop was uneventful, but as I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed it was eerily quiet. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the asphalt. I parked in the very back, where the darkness seemed to swallow my truck whole. My dog, Noodles, a scruffy little terrier, whined in the passenger seat, sensing my unease. I took Noodles out for a quick walk, and as we strolled through the deserted lot, I noticed a man standing behind a trailer, just staring into space. His presence sent a shiver down my spine, and I quickened my pace, hurrying Noodles back to the safety of the truck. After settling Noodles in, I grabbed my dinner bag and headed to the truck stop's restaurant. As I walked, the sound of footsteps echoed behind me. I turned to see the same man from the trailer following me at a distance. My heart raced, and I picked up my pace, weaving through the parked trucks. But no matter how many turns I took, he kept pace with me, always lurking just out of sight. I pushed open the door to the restaurant, grateful for the warm glow and bustling atmosphere inside. The place was packed, and I slid onto a stool at the bar, ordering a burger and fries. As I waited for my food, I glanced around, searching for the mysterious man, but he was nowhere to be seen. Halfway through my meal, nature called, and I excused myself to use the restroom. When I returned, my fork was on the right side of my plate. I'm left-handed, and I always place my utensils on the left. A chill ran down my spine. Someone had touched my food. I called the waitress over, still standing behind my chair, and asked if she had messed with my meal. She denied it, and I asked if she'd seen anyone else near my plate. She shook her head, too busy to notice anything. I requested the manager, and when he arrived, I told him about the strange man and my tampered food. But the manager's expression turned serious, and he offered to replace my meal and move me to a safer seat. As I waited for my new food to arrive, he disappeared into the office and returned with a stern look. I reviewed the camera feed, he said, and a man did indeed approach your plate while you were in the restroom. He added something to your mashed potatoes, stirred it, and left the building. My skin crawled. The manager offered to call the police, and I agreed, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. As I finished my new meal, the manager sat down across from me, his eyes scanning the restaurant. "I don't want you to leave alone," he said. "The police will escort you to your truck." Before long, 2 officers arrived, taking statements and searching the premises. They found no sign of the mysterious man, but promised to keep an eye on the truck stop. One of the officers offered to drive me back to my rig, and as we walked through the dark lot, I felt a sense of gratitude toward these kind strangers. As we reached my truck, the officer told me his partner would keep watch over the lot all night, ensuring my safety. I thanked them both, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. The night had been long and terrifying, but thanks to the kindness of strangers, I made it through unscathed. As I settled in for the night, Noodles curled up beside me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the mysterious man was still out there, watching and waiting. But with the police keeping watch, I felt a sense of security, and eventually my eyelids grew heavy, and I drifted off. When I was about 13, I spent the night over at my cousin's house. It was a small, cozy place tucked away in the countryside, surrounded by tall trees and darkness. My cousin and I were home alone for the night, as his parents were out of town. We were thrilled at the prospect of staying up late, playing video games until the early hours of the morning. As the night grew darker, we huddled together in his room, the glow of the TV screen casting eerie shadows on the walls. The only sounds were the clicking of buttons and the occasional creak of the old house settling. I was engrossed in the game, sitting on the edge of the bed, when suddenly my cousin got up to use the restroom. I barely noticed his absence, too focused on the game to pay much attention. But then I felt something behind me, a presence in the room that shouldn't have been there. Without thinking, I turned to speak to my cousin, but he wasn't there. Confusion washed over me as I scanned the empty room. That's when I noticed it, the faint impression on the bed where someone had been sitting just moments before. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach as I realized I wasn't alone. I called out for my cousin, but there was no response. Fear crept into my mind as I considered the possibility of something sinister lurking in the darkness. I hesitated to look under the bed or in the closet, fearing what I might find. Instead, I forced myself to stay calm, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Hours passed and my cousin still hadn't returned from the restroom. Anxiety gnawed at me as I debated whether to leave the safety of the room to search for him. Eventually, curiosity and concern got the better of me, and I ventured out into the dimly lit hallway. The house seemed different at night, stranger, more ominous. Shadows danced along the walls, and every creak of the floorboards sent shivers down my spine. I called out for my cousin again, but there was no response. I made my way to the bathroom, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was closed, and I hesitated before knocking softly. "Cousin?" I whispered, hoping for a reply. Silence greeted me, and a sense of dread washed over me. With trembling hands, I pushed open the door, bracing myself for what I might find. But the bathroom was empty, no sign of my cousin anywhere. Panic surged through me as I realized he was gone, vanished without a trace. Frantically, I searched the rest of the house, calling out his name into the darkness, but there was no response. As the minutes turned into hours, I began to fear the worst. What if something had happened to him? What if there was someone or something else in the house with us? With each passing moment, my fear grew, until it felt like it would consume me entirely. I was on the verge of tears when I heard it, a whisper echoing through the darkness. "Help me." The voice was faint, barely audible above the sound of my pounding heart, but it sent chills down my spine, filling me with a sense of dread, unlike anything I had ever felt before. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing through the empty house. It led me to the basement, a place I had always found unsettling, even in the light of day. As I descended the stairs, the air grew colder, and a sense of unease settled over me like a thick fog. I hesitated at the bottom, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to listen for any sign of life. And then I heard it, the sound of someone crying. It was coming from the far corner of the room, hidden in the shadows. I approached slowly, my footsteps echoing off the concrete floor, and then I saw him, my cousin, huddled in the corner, his face streaked with tears. Relief washed over me as I rushed to his side, wrapping my arms around him in a tight embrace. "What happened?" I asked, my voice trembling with fear. My cousin looked up at me, his eyes wide with terror. "I don't know," he whispered. "I was in the restroom and then something grabbed me. Something cold and inhuman." I felt a chill run down my spine as I listened to his words. Whatever had happened to him, it was something beyond my comprehension, something dark and malevolent. Together, we made our way back upstairs, our hearts still racing with fear. We locked ourselves in his room, too afraid to venture out into the unknown. And as the night wore on, we huddled together, clinging to each other for comfort, knowing that whatever had happened to us, we would never be the same again. It was a dark, chilly evening, and I was driving alone on the deserted road. My job as a delivery driver often took me through remote areas like this, but I never felt uneasy before. As I cruised down the empty highway, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. I turned my head and saw a woman sitting in the passenger seat of a car next to me. Her hair was twisted into a tight bun, just like Miss Trunchbull from that movie. But what caught my attention was her terrified expression. She stared at me with wide eyes, as if she had seen a ghost. Before I could react, the car abruptly veered off at the next exit, leaving me bewildered. I shook my head, trying to shake off the eerie feeling creeping up my spine, but the encounter lingered in my mind as I continued my journey. About half an hour later, another car pulled up alongside me. This time, the driver was different, but the woman in the passenger seat was the same. Her hair was still in that tight bun, and her expression remained frozen in fear. It was unnerving to see her again, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to pull over at the next rest stop to report the strange sightings to the authorities. But before I could make a move, the car disappeared into the darkness. I cursed under my breath, feeling frustrated and helpless. I continued driving, my senses on high alert. Hours passed, and I was nearing London when it happened again. The same car, the same woman, the same terrified expression. But this time, something was different. She seemed to be screaming at me, her mouth forming silent words of desperation. I felt a chill run down my spine as I watched her. Without hesitation, I pulled over into a nearby lay-by and dialed the emergency number. My heart raced as I recounted the bizarre encounters to the dispatcher. To my relief, they informed me that they had received similar reports from other drivers in the area. As I waited for the authorities to arrive, I couldn't shake off the feeling of dread that engulfed me. What was happening? Who was the woman in the car, and why did she look so terrified? Minutes felt like hours, as I sat alone in the darkness, the only sound being the distant hum of passing cars. When the police finally arrived, I eagerly shared every detail of my encounters with them. But despite their efforts, they couldn't find any trace of the mysterious woman or the car. I drove home that night with a heavy heart, haunted by the memory of the woman's terrified face. I couldn't shake off the feeling that I had witnessed something otherworldly, something beyond my comprehension. In the days that followed, I scoured the news for any mention of the strange sightings, but there was nothing. It was as if the encounters had never happened, as if I had imagined it all. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something sinister lurking on that desolate highway, something that defied logic and reason. And though I tried to convince myself otherwise, I couldn't shake off the feeling that I had come face to face with the supernatural that night. From that day on, I avoided driving alone on deserted highways, always keeping an eye out for any sign of the mysterious woman with the haunted expression. But no matter how far I drove, her image remained etched in my mind, a chilling reminder of the night I encountered something beyond my understanding. As I looked back on that fateful night, I couldn't help but wonder, was it all just a coincidence? Or had I stumbled upon a glimpse of the unknown, a glimpse of the things that lurk in the shadows, unseen and unexplained? I was home alone for the week, as my family had gone on vacation while I had to stay and work. It was around 2 a.m., and I'd stayed up to watch a scary movie in the dark in my basement. I was intent on really scaring myself and seeing how far into terror I could go, while still knowing I was safe in my own home. It was then that I heard pounding footsteps on the first floor. This was a common annoying occurrence when my family was home. I heard their footsteps every time they passed through the front hallway, past the basement door. This time, fear immediately shot through me at the sound. My reflex was to turn the television off immediately. The basement door was up a flight of steps and around a corner, so whoever it was would not have seen any light. I heard the basement door handle click and turn as I sat in darkness. I moved slowly to be silent and crawled behind our large television. As I passed it inch by inch, I noted with panic that its black screen still dimly glowed. I heard footsteps coming down the carpeted but creaky stairs. I froze in my hiding place, listening. For many long minutes, I heard nothing. Had the intruder seen the television's afterglow, or had it faded in time? Was he standing in the pitch dark listening for me? I seemed to lie there in total silence for an interminably long time. My panic began to fade, and I began to think more clearly. Had I heard an intruder? Could someone possibly be standing there in silence for so long without making any noise? The basement was so exceedingly quiet that the silence itself began to hurt my ears. Could the unknown person avoid any noise from shuffling or breathing or anything else? If there was an intruder, he was still in the basement because the creaky stairs were incredibly loud. The door handle clicked, and he wouldn't know to mask his footsteps on the first floor so that they couldn't be heard down here. I began counting in my head, trying to pass the time. As drool fell from my mouth onto the carpet, I didn't dare risk the sound of swallowing. I reached 60 seconds once, twice, 30 times, 60 times. By now my fear had faded and I was more confused than anything. I estimated I'd been crouched in the absolute black for almost 2 hours and had still heard nothing. If there was an intruder, none of this made sense. Finally, I decided I'd have to make a move. If I did nothing, eventually the sun would come up and shine in through the small basement windows. And worse, I began to smell something horrible and cloying. Slowly, ever so, I began inching my way towards the stairs by way of the walls. If someone was standing there in the dark, I should be able to go around them and then make a break up the stairs. Meanwhile, the horrible odor grew stronger. Had something died down here in the night? No living person would smell like that. Terrible images of some sort of corpse monster listening for me in the dark erupted in my thoughts, and I moved as fast as I could without making a sound. Just as I finally approached the stairs, there was an enormous clatter, as if something falling or collapsing on the floor. It was at that moment I leaped forward and crashed up the stairs, running out through the open basement door and my wide-open front door. Now certain that someone was in the house, I called the police from my cell phone and watched my house from afar. The police came, checked inside the house, and then grimly came back out to question me. They'd found a body in the house, my elderly neighbor, who seemed to have died of a heart attack. They believed that I must have left the front door unlocked, and he must have wandered into my house while dying, looking for help. At first, I felt horrible, thinking that I had sat there in the dark while the old man died a few feet away. Then it occurred to me, what the hell was that loud noise of things falling? That last prompted me to bolt up the stairs and out of the house. I asked the police, and they confirmed the back door of my house had been left open as well, near a single bare footprint in the mud. Somehow, for some reason I'll never know, there was someone else in that basement with us. Silent, waiting, and listening in the dark over the fresh corpse of an old man. I was a new nurse at an old hospital and had only been working there for a couple of months. The hospital, with its creaky floors and dimly lit corridors, always gave me a sense of unease. But I was determined to prove myself as a competent nurse, despite the eerie atmosphere. One night, I was assigned to care for Mr. Thompson, an elderly man who had been admitted for pneumonia. As I entered his room, I noticed he was staring intently at the corner of the room, his eyes wide with fear. "Mr. Thompson, is everything all right?" I asked, trying to hide my apprehension. He turned to me, his voice trembling. "There's a girl standing in the corner. She's been there for hours, just watching me." I glanced towards the corner, but saw nothing except shadows cast by the flickering light. "There's no one there, Mr. Thompson. It must be your imagination." But he shook his head vigorously. "No, she's real. She's been haunting me since I got here." I reassured him as best as I could, but his fear was palpable. Throughout the night, he would glance nervously at the corner, muttering about the ghostly girl. As the hours passed, an unsettling feeling crept over me. I couldn't shake the sensation that we were not alone in the room. Every so often, I would catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. As the clock struck midnight, I decided to check on Mr. Thompson again. But when I entered his room, he was no longer there. Panic surged through me as I frantically searched the room, but he was nowhere to be found. Just then, a chilling breeze swept through the room, causing the hairs on the back of my neck to stand on end. I turned towards the corner and saw her, the ghostly girl that Mr. Thompson had spoken of. She was pale and translucent, her eyes hollow and empty. She stared at me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I wanted to run, to flee from the room and never look back. But something held me in place. A morbid curiosity mingled with a sense of duty to my patient. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. The ghostly girl tilted her head slightly, as if considering her response. Then, in a voice that sounded like it came from the depths of the grave, she spoke. "I am trapped here, cursed to wander these halls for eternity. But you can help me." Her words sent a chill coursing through my veins. "How can I help you?" She beckoned me closer, her spectral hand outstretched. "Find the locket. It holds the key to my freedom. Find it and set me free." I hesitated, unsure whether to trust the ghostly apparition before me. But something in her eyes, a desperation mingled with sorrow, compelled me to listen. "Where can I find the locket?" I asked, my voice barely steady. She pointed towards the hospital's abandoned wing, a place rumored to be haunted by restless spirits. With that, she vanished into thin air, leaving me alone in the darkness. Determined to uncover the truth, I ventured into the abandoned wing of the hospital. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay, sending a shiver down my spine. As I made my way towards the attic, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows danced along the walls, whispering secrets long forgotten. Finally, I reached the attic and began my search. Boxes piled high with old medical equipment and yellowed patient records lined the walls, creating a maze of forgotten relics. But amidst the chaos, I spotted it, a small, tarnished locket nestled among the debris. With trembling hands, I reached out and grasped it, feeling its weight in my palm. As I held the locket, a sense of foreboding washed over me. I knew that by opening it, I would unleash forces beyond my comprehension. But I also knew that it was the only way to fulfill my promise to the ghostly girl. With a deep breath, I opened the locket, revealing a faded photograph inside. It was of a young girl, her face filled with innocence and joy. Suddenly, a piercing scream echoed through the attic, sending me reeling backward. I looked up to see the ghostly girl standing before me, her form flickering in and out of existence. "You've done it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the din. "You've set me free." As she spoke, a blinding light enveloped her, illuminating the attic in an otherworldly glow. And then, with a final wisp of smoke, she vanished into the ether, leaving behind only silence. I stood there, alone in the attic, the weight of what had just transpired settling over me. But amidst the fear and uncertainty, there was also a sense of peace. For I had helped a soul find redemption, and in doing so, had discovered a strength within myself that I never knew existed. My parents got divorced in 1997, and I was born in 1990, so I was 7 at the time. They stayed friends, but my mom moved out to my grandparents' old house. My grandparents had quite a lot of money, and had recently moved without selling the house. So there was no problem for them to let my mother and us move into their old house. We ended up living there for about 5 years. It was me, my mother, and my 2 sisters who are a few years older than me, and our dog. The house had 3 floors. The ground floor, basement, and upper floor where me and my sisters slept. The basement was the most horrific place in the house. The stairs led from the basement up to the first floor, then to the second floor, like a spiral. And most of the steps would creak and make lots of sound when stepping on them. Several times a week, you would hear footsteps slowly walking from the basement up the stairs, taking a short break at the ground floor, and then moving to the second floor. Most of the time, the steps would stop at my older sister's room, but it would vary and sometimes stop outside my room or my middle sister's room. We all heard it. My mom did not like to talk about it, but my sisters and I often talked about it the day after and confirmed hearing it outside whatever room it stopped by. We all hated going down to the basement. It was a big, big basement that you would think children would enjoy playing in, but we hated it. Our dog never went down to the basement. She hated it just as much as us. All kinds of minor things happened down in the basement. The light would turn off randomly, things moved, and you could often hear stuff moving down there even though no one was down there. One evening, I and my sisters were playing with walkie-talkies, trying to get to the local police channel. This time, the voice in the walkie-talkie was different and sounded much closer. The voice said all kinds of things. It was speaking directly to my oldest sister and said that it was going to hurt her. It even spoke her name, but I don't think it ever answered our questions. We got scared and turned off the walkie-talkie. A minute or so later, our dog ran into our room and barked out into nothing. Our dog was large and protective of us kids and kept staying in the room, barking, which had never happened before or after. Another time, I and my mom were home, but my sisters and dog were away. I was playing up in my room and my mom was doing whatever moms do. Suddenly, I heard really loud footsteps from the basement, even though I was on the second floor in my room, walking, almost running up from the basement, then continuing up the stairs to the second floor. I remember my heart just stopped when listening to the footsteps. My mom never walks that heavy and angry. The footsteps continued until outside my room, then stopped and my door was slammed hard. The door closed and I screamed and cried. My mom raced up the stairs and tried to open the door, but she couldn't. It was as if the door was locked, though I don't think the door had a locking mechanism. My mom shouted to me to be calm while she ran down to get tools to tear the door down. While she was down, and 7-8-year-old I was crying, the door suddenly unlocked itself and opened. Another time when my sisters and my dog were away, there was a storm, and for some reason, I was deathly afraid of the thunder. I have never been afraid of thunder before or after, but this night I was, and in the basement, everything went crazy. We heard things thrown around down there, glass shattering, which we confirmed in the morning after that glass and stuff had been thrown around and shattered. Footsteps were running up and down the stairs, and my mother hugged each other, both scared of what we were hearing. At one time, we were sitting in the living room, just being deathly scared. The entrance door flew open, then closed, opened, and closed again for several minutes. It was a storm outside, and it was blowing, but this was not the storm. Many more minor things happened. but these are what came to my mind. It seemed to me that it got worse when my dog was not around, and it was more after my older sister. Last night I couldn't sleep at all, which is fairly normal since I work graveyard shifts and it's pretty much turned me into a night owl. So even on my days off, I'm usually up all night long. So I'm up in bed watching a rom-com, laughing and in a great mood, and decided that I deserve to treat myself to the occasional drink. My bar is in my basement, which is fully finished and furnished. It's pretty much a man cave. I've spent entire nights down there by myself or with the gang, and nothing strange has ever happened. So anything creepy or weird down there was the furthest thing from my mind. I finish laughing my butt off and head down there. I go behind the bar, pour myself a drink, and head upstairs. But as I'm on the second to last step to the first floor, from behind me I hear "Hey!" coming from downstairs in the middle of the basement. It was an older man's voice, in their 50s, I think. I know the house is empty except for me, and it scared me. I looked down there and nothing moved, no one spoke or came forward, and I freaked out. I jutted up the last 2 steps and slammed the basement door closed. I'm wondering, did I imagine that? Is there someone in my house? And as I stand there panicking, I hear the same man's voice coming from down in the basement, but muffled by the door. By the intonation, he asked a question, then continued to talk right after. He was talking to me. The question sounded something like, "Where are you going?" I couldn't make much out, especially what he said after that, but I was panicked, adrenaline pumping, and said, "This is scary, someone broke into my house." I ran into the next room, grabbed my flashlight and my handy-dandy baseball bat, and headed back down there. Silence, just silence. Slowly, I turned on every light in every room down there, ready to defend myself, but nothing. Every nook and corner was checked, and the basement was empty, except for me. I went down to the basement this afternoon, after I woke up, with my trusty bat in hand, and rechecked the whole place. I found nothing, no one, just me questioning both my sanity and reality. I know what I heard. That guy was pretty loud, and he was talking in my direction and AT me. Even through the door, I heard him talking down there at me up the stairs. It seemed like he was trying to have a conversation with me. I've never had any kind of break-in. This is a very safe neighborhood, or any kind of remotely strange experience down there in my 15 years here. Does stuff like this happen to people out of the blue, or am I finally losing my mind? I don't know what to do now. It happened at 1:50 a.m. At this point, I believe it most likely was paranormal, and I think I'm going to go down there tonight to repeat the same process at the same time and see what happens. My curiosity's gotten the better of me, and I want to know what it has to say. If it's an intruder, I'm coming prepared this time, but it should still be very interesting. I've been down here from 1:45 a.m. until 3 a.m., walking around asking and looking, and nothing. Part of me feels like it needs the darkness, or even just that element of unpredictability to manifest. A couple of years ago, I was home alone. My husband was traveling out of state for work, leaving me to fend for myself in our quiet little house. It was one of those evenings where the wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the darkness seemed to seep into every corner of the house. I decided to make myself some dinner and settled into the kitchen, the comforting aroma of spices and sizzling food filling the air. To keep myself company, I turned on the news on our Samsung Smart TV, propping the remote on the coffee table before heading back to the kitchen to attend to my cooking. After a few minutes of chopping vegetables and stirring pots, I realized that the sound of the news had vanished. Puzzled, I wiped my hands on a dish towel and walked back into the living room. To my surprise, the TV screen displayed a picture of a couch, but not just any couch, it was the one in our living room. Confusion gripped me as I tried to make sense of what was happening. How could the TV be showing a live video of our living room? I glanced around, searching for any signs of intrusion, but everything seemed undisturbed. The remotes were still lying innocently on the coffee table, untouched. A chill crept down my spine as I realized the gravity of the situation. Someone was watching me through our television. Panic welled up inside me, but I knew I had to act fast. With trembling hands, I reached for a roll of duct tape and covered the camera on the TV, hoping to cut off whoever's prying eyes were invading our home. For the next few days, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards and every flicker of the lights sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't help but wonder how long we had been under surveillance before I discovered it. Then, one evening, as I was getting ready for bed, a news report caught my attention. The headline sent a shiver down my spine. Samsung smart TVs vulnerable to hacking. My heart raced as I listened to the reporter detail the security flaw that allowed hackers to remotely access the cameras on certain models of Samsung smart TVs. It was as if a cold hand had gripped my heart, squeezing it with fear. I glanced nervously at the TV in the living room, knowing that it had been our portal into the privacy of our home. How many times had someone watched us without our knowledge? The thought sent chills down my spine. From that day on, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking presence. Every sound echoed with suspicion. I became hyper-vigilant, checking every corner of the house for signs of intrusion. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over our home. It was as if a dark cloud hung over us, casting a shadow over our once peaceful existence. Then one night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere in the house. My heart skipped a beat as I strained my ears, listening intently for any sign of movement. The scratching grew louder, more insistent until it seemed to fill the entire house. Panic seized me as I realized that whatever was making that sound was getting closer, inching its way toward me with each passing moment. With trembling hands, I reached for the phone on the bedside table, ready to call for help. But before I could dial a number, the scratching stopped abruptly, leaving behind an eerie silence that seemed to echo through the darkness. I lay frozen in bed, my heart pounding in my chest as I waited for anything to happen. But the house remained still, as if holding its breath, waiting for whatever was out there to make its next move. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the scratching started again. Only this time, it wasn't coming from outside the house. It was coming from the living room, from the very same TV that had been our unwitting gateway into the world of surveillance. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I realized that the source of the scratching was not some unknown intruder, but something far more sinister. Something that had been lurking in the shadows of our own home all along. As the scratching grew louder and more frantic, I knew that whatever was on the other side of that TV was not human. It was something dark, something malevolent, something that had been waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. And as I lay there, paralyzed with fear, I knew that our nightmare was far from over. For in the darkness of the night, with no one to hear our cries for help, we were at the mercy of whatever lurked on the other side of that TV screen. It was a scary night. My parents had left earlier for a dinner party, leaving me home alone. Normally, I didn't mind being by myself, but tonight was different. Tonight, something felt off. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the glowing numbers on my alarm clock. It was past midnight, and the darkness outside seemed to seep into every corner of the house. I wrapped myself tighter in my blanket, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Suddenly I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible over the howling wind. My name, Tom, it called, drifting up from downstairs. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in terror. Who could be calling my name at this hour? My parents wouldn't be back for hours, and I didn't have any friends nearby. I strained my ears, listening intently for any other sounds. The house was eerily silent, except for the occasional creaks and groans of its aging structure. I hesitated, debating whether to investigate or stay put in the safety of my room. Curiosity and fear warred within me, but ultimately, curiosity won out. I had to know who or what was calling my name. With trembling hands, I slipped out of bed and tiptoed to my bedroom door. Peering into the dimly lit hallway, I took a deep breath and summoned all the courage I could muster. Slowly, I descended the stairs, each step echoing loudly in the silent house. The air grew colder with every step, sending shivers down my spine. As I reached the bottom of the staircase, the whisper came again, louder this time. "Tom," it called, sounding closer now, as if it was right around the corner. I swallowed hard, my throat dry with fear. Steeling myself, I rounded the corner and entered the living room. The room was bathed in darkness, illuminated only by the pale moonlight filtering through the curtains. I squinted into the shadows, searching for any sign of movement. That's when I saw it, a figure standing by the window, its silhouette stark against the moonlit backdrop. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached cautiously, my footsteps barely making a sound on the carpeted floor. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond, but I could feel its gaze boring into me, cold and unrelenting. With a trembling hand, I reached for the light switch, flicking it on in one swift motion. The room flooded with light, illuminating the figure before me. It was nothing, just a coat rack draped with my parents' coats, swaying gently in the breeze. I let out a shaky sigh of relief, feeling foolish for letting my imagination run wild. But then I heard it again, The whisper closer now, right behind me. "Tom," it hissed, sending chills down my spine. I whirled around, but there was nobody there. Just space and the faint sound of the wind outside. Panic seized me then, and I bolted for the front door, desperate to escape whatever unseen presence haunted our house. But as I reached for the doorknob, a cold hand gripped my shoulder, sending shockwaves of terror through my body. I spun around to face my attacker, but there was nobody there. Just an empty hallway, stretching out before me like a corridor of nightmares. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet as I tried to flee. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl emanating from the darkness. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before, primal and full of menace. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing as I backed away from the unseen threat. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the growling stopped. The house fell silent once more, the only sound the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I stood there, frozen in terror, unsure of what to do next. But then I remembered the phone. I had to call for help. With trembling hands, I fumbled for my cell phone, dialing my parents' number with shaking fingers. But as the phone rang on the other end, I realized something chilling. The voice that answered was not my mother's or father's. It was the voice from downstairs, the one that had been calling my name all along. "Tom," it whispered, sending a shiver down my spine. "You shouldn't have come looking for me, Tom. Now you're mine." And with that, the line went dead, leaving me alone in the darkness with whatever unseen horror lurked in the shadows. I sank to my knees, tears streaming down my face as I realized the truth. I was not alone in the house, and whatever was with me, it was hungry for more than just my name. I'm 23 years old. My name's Jake. My girlfriend Sarah and I love exploring abandoned places. We find it thrilling to walk through places that are long forgotten, each step echoing with the whispers of the past. But nothing could prepare us for what we encountered that fateful night at the old haunted hospital. It was a chilly autumn evening when we decided to explore the abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the decrepit building. Ivy climbed the walls, and broken windows stared out like empty eye sockets. Despite its ominous appearance, we couldn't resist the allure of the unknown. As we approached the entrance, a sense of unease washed over me. I could feel the weight of the building's history pressing down on me like a heavy fog. But I pushed aside my apprehension, eager to satisfy our curiosity. The rusty gates creaked open as we stepped into the courtyard. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the silence was suffocating. We made our way through the overgrown weeds, our footsteps echoing off the crumbling walls. Inside, the hospital was a maze of dark corridors and empty rooms. Each step we took sent shivers down my spine, as if we were intruding on something that should have remained undisturbed. Sarah clutched my hand tightly as we ventured deeper into the bowels of the building. The sound of our breathing seemed amplified in the stillness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Suddenly, we heard a faint sound coming from somewhere nearby. It was like a whisper, barely audible above the sound of our heartbeat. We froze, listening intently as the whisper grew louder, echoing through the empty halls. Without a word, we followed the sound, our hearts pounding in our chests. It led us to a staircase that spiraled down into darkness. With trembling hands, we descended into the abyss, our flashlights cutting through the shadows like knives. At the bottom of the stairs, we found ourselves in a dimly lit corridor lined with doors. Each one seemed to beckon to us, promising secrets and horrors beyond imagination. With a sense of dread, we began to explore, opening door after door in search of the source of the whisper. But as we delved deeper into the maze-like corridors, the whisper seemed to grow louder, filling the air with an almost tangible sense of dread. It was then that we realized we were not alone. Shapes moved in the darkness, flitting in and out of sight like phantoms. I could feel eyes watching us from the shadows, their gaze cold and unrelenting. And with each passing moment, the whispers grew louder, their words twisting and warping into something sinister. Panic clawed at my chest as we stumbled through the labyrinthine halls, desperate to escape the unseen horrors that lurked in the darkness. But no matter which way we turned, the whispers followed us, their voices growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. Just when I thought we couldn't take it anymore, we stumbled upon a door unlike any other we had seen. It was old and weathered, its surface marred by years of neglect. But as we approached, the whispers grew deafening, filling the air with their cacophony of voices. With trembling hands, I pushed open the door, revealing a room bathed in an eerie blue light. Shadows danced across the walls, their movements fluid and unnatural. And in the center of the room, we saw it. A figure stood before us, its features shrouded in darkness. Its eyes gleamed with an otherworldly light, and its mouth twisted into a cruel smile. It was the source of the whispers, the embodiment of all the fear and dread that had haunted us since we set foot in this accursed place. Without a word, Sarah and I turned and fled, our hearts pounding in our chests. We raced through the corridors, our footsteps echoing off the walls as we ran for our lives. And though we could still hear the whispers echoing in our minds, we refused to look back, determined to escape the horrors of the haunted hospital once and for all. As we burst through the gates and into the cool night air, we breathed a sigh of relief, grateful to be alive. But even as we put distance between ourselves and the abandoned hospital, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us out, something that would haunt our dreams for years to come. A couple of years ago, I was home alone, enjoying a rare night of peace. My parents had gone out for a dinner date, and my siblings were away at college. I was looking forward to a night of binge-watching my favorite TV show and indulging in some guilty pleasure snacks. As I settled into the couch, I noticed that the house was eerily quiet. The creaks and groans of the old wooden floorboards seemed louder than usual, and the wind outside seemed to be whispering strange melodies. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as the night wore on, the strange noises grew louder and more frequent. I heard footsteps outside my room and the sound of someone rummaging through the kitchen. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling, but deep down, I knew something was off. I decided to investigate, my heart racing with anticipation. I slowly got up from the couch and made my way to the kitchen, my senses on high alert. As I entered the kitchen, I was met with an unsettling sight. The lights were on, and the room was spotless, but there was a feeling of unease in the air. Suddenly, I heard a faint whispering in my ear. It was a soft, raspy voice, and it seemed to be coming from all around me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The voice grew louder, more urgent, and I could make out the words, "Get out while you still can." I knew then that I had to act fast. I quickly grabbed my phone and dashed to the front door. But as I reached for the handle, I realized it was locked. I was trapped. The whispering grew louder and more menacing, and I knew I had to think fast. I ran back to the living room and grabbed a nearby vase, ready to defend myself if necessary. As I stood there frozen with fear, I heard the sound of footsteps coming from the hallway. They were heavy and deliberate, and they seemed to be getting closer. I raised the vase, ready to strike, but as the figure entered the room, I realized it was not what I expected. It was a woman, tall and gaunt, with long silver hair and eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. She was dressed in a long white gown, and she moved with a slow, deliberate pace. As she approached me, I could feel a chill run down my spine. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't respond, but instead she reached out a bony hand and touched my face. I felt a surge of electricity run through my body, and suddenly I was flooded with visions of the past. I saw a family, happy and laughing, but also a tragedy, a loss that seemed to consume them all. I saw the woman standing in the same spot, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. As the visions faded, I realized that the woman was a ghost, trapped in our home for decades. And I knew that I had to help her find peace. With a newfound sense of courage, I reached out and took her hand. Together, we walked through the house, uncovering secrets and memories that had been hidden for years. As we reached the front door, I knew it was time to let her go. I opened the door and she vanished into the night, her eyes finally at peace. As I stood there, feeling a sense of relief wash over me, I knew that I would never forget this night. I had faced my fears and helped a lost soul find peace, and I knew that I would always be grateful for that. A few years ago, my life took a turn that I never expected. It all began when I decided to live alone in our big house. My parents and I had some disagreements, and I wanted to prove to them that I could handle myself. So I moved into our home, determined to show them that I could manage just fine on my own. I was a young girl, full of hope and excitement for my newfound independence. Our house was old, with creaky floors and drafty hallways, but I loved it nonetheless. It was my sanctuary, my haven, away from the troubles of the world. Living alone wasn't easy at first. There were nights when I felt scared and vulnerable, the silence of the house echoing around me like a haunting melody. But I pushed through, determined to prove myself to my parents and myself. One fateful night, as I lay in bed reading a book, I heard a noise coming from the basement. At first, I dismissed it as the house settling, or maybe even a stray animal finding its way inside. But as the minutes passed, the noise grew louder and more distinct, sending shivers down my spine. Curiosity got the better of me, and I summoned up the courage to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight from the bedside table and made my way down the creaky stairs, the darkness of the basement enveloping me like a thick fog. As I descended into the depths of the basement, my heart pounded in my chest, each step echoing loudly in the silence. I swept the flashlight around, illuminating the dusty corners and cobweb-covered shelves, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard a faint whimper coming from behind a stack of boxes. My pulse quickened, and I cautiously approached, the beam of light trembling in my trembling hand. And then I saw him, a man huddled in the corner, his eyes wide with fear as he stared back at me. I froze, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Who was he? How did he get into my house? And why was he hiding in my basement? Before I could gather my wits, the man spoke, his voice trembling with fear and desperation. He told me that he had been homeless, seeking shelter from the cold when he stumbled upon my house. He begged me not to call the police, promising to leave and never return if I spared him. I hesitated, torn between fear and compassion. Part of me wanted to call the police and have him arrested for trespassing, but another part couldn't bear to see him suffer. In the end, my compassion won out, and I helped him out of the basement and into the night, promising to keep his secret. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the back of my mind. What if he came back? What if he was dangerous? I tried to push those thoughts aside, telling myself that I had done the right thing by showing him kindness. But then, one night, as I lay in bed listening to the sound of the wind howling outside, I heard it again. The noise from the basement was louder this time, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing through the house. My heart raced as I grabbed the flashlight and crept downstairs, my hands trembling with fear. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw him again, the man from the basement, standing in the middle of the room with a wild look in his eyes. Before I could react, he lunged towards me, his hands outstretched as if to grab me. I screamed and stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest as I frantically searched for something, anything, to defend myself with. And then out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A baseball bat leaning against the wall nearby. With a surge of adrenaline, I lunged for it, gripping it tightly in my hands as I turned to face the man. But he was gone, vanished into thin air as if he had never been there at all. I stood there, shaking with fear and confusion, unsure of what had just happened. I wanted to call the police, to tell them everything that had happened, but a part of me feared they wouldn't believe me. They would think I was crazy, that I had imagined the whole thing. So I kept silent, telling myself that it was just a figment of my imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by fear and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was someone in my house, someone who didn't belong, and they were watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Weeks passed, and the feeling of unease never left me. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, and that there was nothing to be afraid of, but the fear never truly left me. And then one day, as I was cleaning out the basement, I found it. A makeshift bed hidden behind a stack of boxes, along with empty food wrappers and discarded clothing. Someone had been living down here, right under my nose, without me even realizing it. I felt sick to my stomach as the realization sank in. How long had they been here? What did they want from me? And most importantly, where were they now? I wanted to run, to flee from the house and never look back. But a part of me knew that wouldn't solve anything. I needed to confront whoever was behind this, to put an end to the terror that had consumed my life for far too long. With a newfound determination, I called the police and told them everything. About the man in the basement, about the noises in the night, about the fear that had gripped me for weeks on end. They arrived soon after, their faces grim as they listened to my story. They searched the house from top to bottom, but found no sign of the man who had been living in my basement. But just as I was beginning to lose hope, they made a breakthrough. A neighbor had reported seeing a suspicious-looking man lurking around the area, and when they questioned him, he confessed to everything. He had been living in my basement for weeks, watching me from the shadows as I went about my daily life. He claimed he meant no harm, that he was just desperate for shelter and food, but I knew better. As they led him away in handcuffs, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The nightmare was finally over, and I could finally reclaim my life without fear or paranoia. This happened to me last summer, when I was back at my parents' house during the holidays. I had just finished college and was looking forward to a relaxing break. My parents' house is in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by tall trees that cast long shadows at night. It's a cozy place, but it can feel a bit creepy when you're alone at night. It was around 3 a.m., and I was in my room, scrolling through my phone. I was wide awake, despite the late hour. Suddenly, my phone rang, and I saw my sister's name on the screen. That was already a bit weird, since her room was just down the hallway from mine, and she could have just come in and talked to me. But I picked up the phone anyway, and as soon as I said hello, the call ended. I thought maybe she had hung up by mistake, so I got out of bed and walked down the hallway to her room. As soon as I reached her door, I heard her screaming. It was a loud, terrified scream, and it sent chills down my spine. I quickly opened the door and rushed inside. She was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with fear and her face pale. I asked her what was wrong, and she pointed to the corner of the room, her hand shaking. I looked over, but there was no one there. She started crying and told me that she had woken up and seen a dark shadow just centimeters from her face. She said it was tall and menacing, and it had made her feel like she was being suffocated. I tried to calm her down, telling her it was just a dream, but she insisted that it was real. She said she had called me for help, but when I reminded her that her phone was downstairs in her purse, she looked confused. That's when things started to get weird. I checked my phone, and there was a log of the call from her number, but when we checked her phone, there was no record of the call. It was as if the call had never happened. We were both confused and a bit spooked, so we decided to go downstairs and As we sat in the kitchen, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. The house was quiet, but I kept hearing creaks and groans like someone was moving around upstairs. I tried to tell myself it was just the old house settling, but deep down, I knew it was something more. We stayed up for a few more hours, trying to make sense of what had happened. But the more we talked, the more confused we became. It was as if we were trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Eventually, we went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the dark shadow my sister had seen, and the mysterious call that had disappeared from her phone. I started to feel like we were being watched, like something was lurking in the shadows, waiting for its moment to strike. The next day, we told our parents what had happened, but they just shrugged it off, saying it was probably just a prank caller or a bad dream. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew what my sister had experienced. It was real, and it was terrifying. After that night, I started to notice strange things around the house. Doors would slam shut on their own, and I would hear footsteps in the hallway at night. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or my imagination, but deep down, I knew it was something more. I started to feel like I was living in a horror movie, and I didn't know how to escape. I was trapped in a never-ending nightmare, and I didn't know how to wake up. One night, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and started searching the house from top to bottom. I looked in every room, every closet, and every corner, but I couldn't find anything out of the ordinary. But as I was about to give up, I heard a faint whisper in my ear. It was a soft, raspy voice, and it seemed to be coming from all around me. "Get out while you still can," it said. I spun around, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, and it sent chills down my spine. I knew then that I had to get out of the house, and fast. I ran back to my room, grabbed my bag, and started packing. My sister saw me and asked what I was doing, and I told her we had to get out of there. She looked scared, but she didn't argue. We quickly packed our bags and left the house, not looking back. We never went back to that house again, and we never spoke about what happened that summer. But I know that I'll never forget the terror I felt and the feeling. My name is Alex. I'm 22 years old, living alone in a cozy little house on the edge of town. It's a quiet place, especially at night when the only sounds you hear are the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional hoot of an owl. Usually I enjoy the solitude, but tonight feels different. It's one of those dark, moonless nights where the darkness seems to swallow everything whole. I find myself sitting in my living room, surrounded by shadows, with only the dim glow of the lamp for company. The clock ticks loudly, marking the passing minutes, and I can't shake this unease gnawing at me all evening. My plan was simple: a night in, me, and a few movies to keep me company. But as the hours go on, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Every creak of the old house makes me jump, and I find myself glancing nervously over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking in the darkness. I try to shake off the feeling, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. But then I hear it, a soft scratching sound coming from somewhere in the house. My heart skips a beat as I strain to listen, but it's gone as quickly as it came, leaving me wondering if I imagined it. I try to focus on the movie playing on the TV, but my mind keeps wandering back to that sound. Maybe it's just a mouse, I tell myself, trying to rationalize away the fear that's starting to creep in. But deep down, I know it's more than that. There's something not right about tonight. With a shaky hand, I reach for the remote, intending to turn off the TV and go to bed. But before I can, I hear it again, the scratching louder this time, more insistent. It's coming from upstairs, I realize, from the direction of my bedroom. I freeze, my breath catching in my throat as a cold sweat breaks out across my skin. Who or what is up there? I want to believe it's just my imagination running wild, but the fear coursing through me tells me otherwise. Summoning every ounce of courage I have, I slowly make my way up the stairs, each step feeling like an eternity. The scratching grows louder with each passing moment, until it's all I can hear, echoing in my ears like a sinister symphony. I reach the top of the stairs and pause, listening intently. The sound seems to be coming from behind the closed door of my bedroom. My hand trembles as I reach for the doorknob, my heart pounding in my chest. With a deep breath, I push the door open, half expecting to come face to face with some unspeakable horror. But the room is empty, bathed in darkness, save for the faint glow of the moon filtering in through the window. Relief washes over me as I step into the room, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But then I saw it, the source of the scratching, a long, jagged scratch running down the length of the wall, like something, or someone, had dragged their nails along it. My blood runs cold as I realize I'm not alone in this house. There's something here with me, something dark and malevolent, lurking in the shadows. And suddenly, the thought of spending another moment in this place fills me with a primal terror, unlike anything I've ever known. I turn to flee, to get as far away from this nightmare as I possibly can, but before I can take a single step, I hear it, the sound of laughter, low and menacing, echoing through the darkness. I freeze, my heart pounding in my chest as the laughter grows louder surrounding me. And then from the depths of the shadows emerges a figure, a twisted, nightmarish creature with glowing eyes and a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. I scream, the sound echoing through the empty house as the creature lunges for me, its claws outstretched, and then everything goes black. When I wake, it's morning, and the sun is shining weakly through the curtains. For a moment, I wondered if it was all just a dream, a trick of my imagination brought on by the darkness of the night. But then I see the scratch on the wall, a cruel reminder of the horrors that lurk in the shadows. And as I flee the house, vowing never to return, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching me, waiting for the next night to strike again. It was a stormy night, the kind where the wind howls like a wounded animal and rain pelts against the windows like icy daggers. Lightning slashes across the sky, casting eerie shadows that dance along the walls. And amid this tempest, I find myself alone with my little brother Tim. Our family had left earlier for a week-long trip, leaving Tim and me to fend for ourselves. I wasn't too thrilled about being responsible for my 8-year-old brother, especially on a night like this. But we had plenty of food, emergency numbers, and assurances from our parents that everything would be fine. As darkness settled over the house, the storm intensified, rattling the windows and shaking the very foundation of our home. Tim and I huddled on the couch, trying to distract ourselves with a movie. But the storm's fury made it hard to focus, and an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. Midnight approached, and Tim had already drifted off to sleep, snuggled up against me for warmth. But I couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that hung in the air. Lightning illuminated the room in brief, stark flashes, casting long, sinister shadows that seemed to reach out for us. And then, amidst the chaos of the storm, I saw him, a tall figure standing outside our window. My heart skipped a beat, and I held my breath, hoping it was just a trick of the lightning. But the figure remained, tall and imposing, his silhouette stark against the darkness. He seemed to be staring right at me, his gaze piercing through the thin veil of rain-soaked glass. I wanted to wake Tim, to tell him what I saw, but fear rooted me to the spot. I watched in horror as the figure moved closer to the window, his movements slow and deliberate. Lightning flashed again, and for a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of his face, pale and twisted with a cruel smile. A cold shiver ran down my spine as the figure tapped on the glass, the sound echoing through the room like a death knell. Tim stirred beside me, but I dared not move. I prayed for morning to come, to chase away the darkness and the terror that came with it. The figure tapped again, more insistently this time, And then, with a sudden jolt, he tried to open the window. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. But before I could do anything, the window creaked open, and the figure slipped inside. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest as the figure straightened up to his full height. He towered over me, his features obscured by the darkness that cloaked him. I could smell the stench of decay emanating from him, a sickly sweet odor that made my stomach churn. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't respond. Instead, he took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate. I could feel his gaze boring into me, cold and unyielding. I wanted to run, to scream for help, but fear held me in its grip. I was paralyzed, unable to move as the figure closed in on me, his presence suffocating. And then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone. I blinked, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Had it all been a dream? A trick of the storm? But then I saw the open window, and I knew it was real. The figure had been here, in our house, mere inches away from me. I stumbled backward, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. I had to get out of here to find somewhere safe until morning came. With trembling hands, I grabbed Tim and rushed out of the house, not daring to look back. As we stumbled into the night, the storm raged on around us, its fury matching the terror that still pulsed through my veins. The figure was out there somewhere, waiting in the darkness. And no matter how far we ran, I knew he would always be one step behind us, his presence haunting our every move. But as the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, chasing away the darkness and the terrors that came with it, I knew one thing for certain. I would never forget the night the tall man came to visit and the fear that he brought with him. The worst thing I've ever experienced was around 1996. I was team driving with another individual. We picked up our load and scaled it out. I opted to drive the first shift. I drove in solid rain from Detroit, Michigan to just shy of St. Louis, Mo. We swapped out at a rest area and caught our logbooks up. I was tired after driving for 10 hours all night in the rain. One thing I'll never forget was before I started driving that night, the other driver, we'll call him John, said to me before going to sleep, "If we get killed, I'll come and haunt you." He said it with a smile and zipped up the curtain to sleep. After swapping seats, I zipped up the curtain and put a movie on to fall asleep. My cousin Vinny. The thought that crossed my mind often, while in the bunk, was what I would do if we were, say, going over an embankment or a cliff. My best decision was to hit the deck, get as low as possible, and pray. While watching the movie, I started drifting off to sleep. It was maybe 45 minutes later I woke up to John saying, "Shit it, hang on." I could tell that we were weaving or whatever. I just knew something wasn't right. He yelled again, and I hit the floor praying hard. Were we going over a cliff? I couldn't see up front because the curtain was zipped closed. The next thing I felt was the entire truck vibrating for a split second. I could tell that it had a violent impact. The strange thing is that there was no loss of forward momentum from the impact. We were near full GVW of 80,000 pounds. I'll never forget that sound and feeling as long as I live. Right after the impact, it happened so fast, I didn't even know what had happened. We had slid on wet pavement, went airborne in the median, and into oncoming traffic west of St. Louis, on 5544, just west of a way station. After hitting a vehicle head-on, our semi had flipped over and was now facing to the east. Suddenly, everything was quiet. I was in shock. John asked if I was okay. I said, "Yeah, let's just get out of here. I smell smoke." I had sat on the passenger side of the floor during the wreck. Now the roof was a door for me to crawl through on my right. John soon followed behind me. There I was standing in my socks on a wet highway mixed with diesel fuel. Smoke was coming from the hood. That was barely recognizable. I wasn't even awake enough to comprehend what had just happened, and was in shock as well. I remember people running to the white pickup truck that we had hit head-on with fire extinguishers. It was like I was in a dream. I couldn't comprehend what was going on. I remember shivering and blood coming from my hand and mouth. When I got myself together, the fire was out. The next thing I remember was an ambulance attendant talking to someone on the passenger side of the white truck. I could tell that she was consoling the person. I saw her mouth the words, "I know," with a compassionate face. The next thing I knew, John and I were in an ambulance, headed for the hospital. I was looking out of the back doors through the windows. As we were pulling away, I started crying uncontrollably, trying to imagine the fear that the people in the white pickup must have felt, seeing this semi coming right at them. I purposely left out a few gory details that nobody should ever have to see or even hear about. When we got to the hospital, I learned that all three in the truck hadn't made it. A man, his wife, and their 4-year-old daughter. I felt the same kind of guilt as the gentleman who mentioned giving CPR to the driver on the ground from a previous comment above. Why did I survive a horrific accident that killed 3 people? I'll never forget the smell that morning, standing in diesel fuel mixed with rain and the smoke. As it turned out, that stretch of highway was nicknamed Blood Alley because of the deep grooves in the road. It was the site of many accidents. Many months later, I drove through that spot and saw that they had patched that stretch of highway. Wish it could have been done sooner. It was very painful to bring this up after all these years, but it serves as a reminder to give driving 100% of your focus. Especially now with people texting, eating, and reading while driving. For God's sake, don't ever take even a small trip for granted.